My name is J.joe. I am 43 years old. This story is inspired by true events. The world it lives in, the town, the faith, the fear, was real. The details that feel too specific to be invented exist because some things cannot be fully imagined. I grew up in the Philippines, in a town where faith wasn't a choice so much as the air you breathed. And now, living in the United States, I can tell you that no amount of distance, not years, not oceans, has put this story to rest. This is the story of Amor and Salome, and what happens when the dead decide they are not finished. Chapter 1. November 1995. It was 1995. I was 12 years old. Our town in the Philippines carried its Catholic roots in everything: stone churches on every corner, nuns whose dark habits seemed to absorb the afternoon light, priests whose voices bled through thick confessional walls. We grew up understanding two things: God was watching, and so was everything else. My friends were as different from each other as the schools they came from. Kathy carried herself like she owned whatever room she walked into, which made sense, since her school charged fees most families in our neighborhood never spoke out loud. I understood that world, at least partly. I attended a different school, but one cut from the same cloth. Catholic, run by a priest, where the rules of God and the rules of the institution were treated as the same thing. Jake and Adrian moved in her orbit, though Jake was always the first to suggest something we probably shouldn't do. Alvin and his younger sister Loan were public school kids. Practical, grounded, unimpressed by anything that couldn't be touched or proven. And then there was Melvie. Quiet, careful Melvie, who joined us for games but always found an excuse when our curiosity led us somewhere darker. None of us knew that November that her caution had been wisdom all along. We were tired that evening, the good kind of tired that only comes from running too hard for too long. We'd been playing The Full Moon, a game we invented ourselves. A circle drawn in the dirt with water, everyone inside it safe from the monster prowling outside. Simple. Loud. Ours. We were cutting past Melvie's house on the way home when her mother came through the gate. She wasn't walking, she was stumbling, her sister right behind her, both of them, in a way that didn't sound like sadness. It sounded like fear that had already moved past the point of being managed. Melvie's mother was a quiet, steady woman, the kind who kept the house calm no matter what it contained. Seeing her like this stopped all of us mid-step. I stayed while my friends ran for their parents. I don't know why. 12-year-old logic maybe, or something quieter pulling me toward the door. Melvie's sister showed me the marks first. 4 clean lines on each cheek, bleeding slowly. Melvie had done it with her own fingernails. They had tied her with ropes. I need you to understand something before I continue. I am not a dramatic person. I was not a dramatic child. What I am about to tell you is not embellished. I have spent 31 years finding the most accurate words I can, and I want you to read them the way I mean them, not as a story, but as a report. I remembered something then. A week earlier, walking home from school, we had spotted Melvie on a street nobody used. She was moving slowly, head down, as though following something only she could see. We called her name from across the road. She didn't look up. That wasn't unusual, we told ourselves later. She hadn't heard us. But I had watched her walk the length of that street and noticed, the way you notice something without knowing you've noticed it, that she never once looked at the ground. Her head was bowed. But her feet moved with a certainty that didn't belong to someone watching their step. Something was guiding her. The street ran alongside the acacia grove, a dense, untouched pocket of trees that had somehow survived the city growing up around it. Locals avoided it without ever quite explaining why. We called it the small forest. Children understood instinctively what adults wouldn't say out loud. By 7 o'clock, the neighborhood had gathered. Parents, neighbors, then priests. 5 of them, arriving one by one until Melvie's room felt less like a room and more like a place between rooms. A threshold. The kind of space that makes you feel your own edges, where you end and the air begins. Rosary beads clicked in the hands of neighbors standing outside in a loose circle. Their murmured prayers rose into the evening air and didn't seem to go anywhere. The sound stayed close to the house, low, almost like the house was breathing it back. Inside, crucifixes covered every wall of Melvy's room. Not in the way a Catholic home decorates, with care, with placement. These were pressed and stacked and overlapped, taped and propped and hung on anything that would hold them. Looking at them made your chest tight in a way you couldn't explain and didn't try. Her brother told us she had destroyed all 10 of their family rosaries. The beads lay scattered across the floor. None of us stepped on them. I don't know why. We just didn't. When we slipped back inside, against every instruction given to us, Melvy was awake. She was speaking in a language none of us recognized. Not shouting, speaking. Calmly, deliberately, as though reciting something she had memorized a very long time ago. I want to tell you how frightening that calm was. Not the words, we couldn't understand the words. It was the tone. When a person speaks in fear or anger or grief, you hear it. The voice carries the feeling. Melvy's voice carried nothing. It was human sound without human feeling behind it. Like a recording of a voice, played back in a room where that voice had never been. Then she stopped and said one name, Amor. For a moment she returned to herself. I know that sounds like a figure of speech. It isn't. I watched it happen. I watched something step back from behind her eyes and leave Melvy standing there alone inside herself, terrified, blinking, her own face again. She wants to destroy me, she sobbed. Amor wants to possess my body and soul. She wants revenge, her and Salome. Then I looked at her properly, at what she had become in the hours we hadn't seen her. I need to explain this carefully because I know how it sounds. Melvy was a girl our age, Spanish-Filipino-American, what we called mestiza. The kind of beauty that stopped adults mid-sentence. Warm complexion, dark red hair that everyone noticed. The person lying on that bed was not Melvy. I mean that with precision. She had Melvy's features, the same nose, the same jaw, but something had been done to them, or something had been done through them. Her skin had shifted to a color I still don't have a name for. Not quite gray, not quite green. The color of something that had been left too long in a place without light. Wrinkles had appeared on her face that hadn't been there that morning. Not the wrinkles of aging, but of something harder. Something that had nothing to do with time. Her hair had gone the flat white of old ash. Not silver, not gray. White, the way bone is white. Her lips had no color at all. She looked like Melvy the way a photograph looks like a person. Something was wearing her face and hadn't quite gotten it right. And the worst part, the part I have never been able to explain away, was that she was still breathing in Melvy's rhythm. That small, familiar rise and fall. The chest of someone we loved, moving in the pattern we knew. While everything else about her had become something I had no name for. Her brother moved in and out of the room with cloths for the nosebleed. He didn't look at her face when he did it. None of us did after the first time. The cold in that room had no source. It simply was. In the corner, Melvy's father had gone very still. When Melvy screamed those names again, he didn't look frightened. He looked recognized. The way a man looks when a debt he thought he'd outrun has finally arrived at his door. The exorcist arrived late, young-faced but carrying the specific stillness of someone who had stood in rooms like this before and had not been broken by them. He gathered information first, asking careful questions. We told him about the acacia grove, about seeing Melvy walking alone, head down, following nothing. He listened without dismissing us. Then he turned to Melvy's father. "Does the name Amor mean anything to you?" The room went quiet. Melvy's father shook his head, but his hands, pressed flat against his thighs as though holding himself together, told a different story. What happened inside the room after our parents pulled us out, we learned later through Lowen's eldest sister, a nurse who stayed. She said the smell came first. Not the smell of the supernatural, not something you could romanticize or mistake for anything other than what it was. Melvie had soiled herself completely, the way the body does when it has lost all control of itself, when something else has taken the wheel and does not care what it leaves behind. The smell hit the room like a wall. Those closest to her gagged immediately. One of the neighbors turned and retched against the door frame. 2 others stumbled out to the hallway. Even the priests, who had steeled themselves for far worse in the spiritual sense, could not keep their composure against something so grotesquely, inescapably physical. The nurse said later that she believed it was deliberate. Not Melvie. Melvie had no agency left. But whatever had taken up residence inside her understood that humans break in many ways. Fear is one. Disgust is another. And if the disgust drove people out of that room, then the prayers grew quieter and the circle grew smaller, and the thing inside had more room to breathe. It played them. Mixed beneath that smell, underneath it, inside it, was something else entirely. Wet earth, fruit left to rot in the dark for days. The smell of something that had been sealed away for a very long time and had now been opened. It came from nowhere in the room. There were no windows open, nothing that could account for it. The 2 smells together were unlike anything she had encountered in all her years of nursing. She said it was the smell of something trying to be everywhere at once, the very human and the very not. Then the heat, not from outside, not from any source you could point to, but from the air itself, as though the room had decided to be warm and was warming from the inside out. Beads of sweat appeared on foreheads that had moments before been cold. The priests continued their prayers without stopping. The neighbors outside did the same, their voices a low, continuous murmur that seemed to hold the walls of the house together by sheer will. Then Melvie's face changed. Not dramatically, that's what she kept saying afterward. Not dramatically, just a slow settling, like watching water find its level. The girl they knew moved back from the surface, and something else came forward, and by the time you understood what you were seeing, it had already happened. Her voice, though unchanged in pitch, began to carry the cadence of someone older, someone who had been waiting a very long time and had grown patient about it. When the priest spoke the names Amor and Salome, Melvie's father broke. Amor, forgive me. Salome, I beg your forgiveness. What followed was not simply a man confessing. It was a man being taken apart. He didn't crumple so much as collapse inward, like something that had been held together by a single thread that had finally given way. He hit the floor on his knees first, then his hands, and the sounds that came out of him were not the sounds of crying. They were something beneath crying, something that had bypassed language entirely and come out the other side as pure animal anguish. His body began to shake, not trembling, shaking, the way a structure shakes when the ground beneath it moves. Sweat broke across him in an instant, soaking through his shirt, darkening it across his back and chest. His face had gone a color that frightened the nurse more than anything else in that room, because she had seen that color before and knew what it meant when the body was being pushed to its absolute limit. And still he kept going. He confessed in broken fragments, a young woman loved and misunderstood, a pregnancy abandoned before he had known the truth, a door walked out of and never returned through, a child who never drew breath. Between each fragment he gasped as though the air itself was resisting him, as though something in that room was deciding word by word whether to allow him to continue. Those watching said later that it was like witnessing a man fight his way through something invisible, that his arms moved at his sides as though pushing against resistance that wasn't there, that at certain moments his face would go utterly blank, not peaceful, not unconscious, but empty in the way a screen goes empty before something new appears on it. And then he would wrench himself back, his eyes finding the priest, his mouth finding the next word. He was not just confessing to a priest, he was confessing to her. and she was listening from inside Melvy's body, and whatever she felt about what she heard was written nowhere on that borrowed face. Melvy's mother stood at the edge of the room and did not understand what was happening. Not the possession. She had accepted that, in the way that people raised in deep faith accept the existence of darkness as readily as they accept light. What she didn't understand was the name, the way her husband had said it, the specific texture of his guilt, not the guilt of a man confronting something supernatural, but the guilt of a man finally being caught. And then something moved in her memory, the way things surface when you have spent years holding them underwater. The letters. They had started arriving perhaps a year after their marriage, or maybe earlier, she couldn't be certain now. A woman's handwriting on the envelopes, addressed to her husband by name. She had given him the first one without thought. He had an explanation ready before she could fully form the question. An old friend, someone from before, nothing to worry about. He had smiled when he said it. He was very good at smiling when he needed to be. She had believed him. Not because she was foolish, because she loved him, and the alternative required her to dismantle something she had built her life inside of. More letters came. Each time she asked, each time he answered. A different story threaded carefully onto the previous one, each lie wearing the borrowed clothes of the last, until the whole structure had its own internal logic, and she had stopped seeing the seams. And then the letters stopped. She had felt relief. She had told herself this meant she had been right to trust him. Standing in that room, watching her husband collapse under the weight of a name she had only ever seen written on an envelope, Melvy's mother understood for the first time that the letters had not stopped because the situation had resolved itself. They had stopped because the person writing them no longer could. She said nothing. She stood very still, and whatever she felt in that moment she kept entirely to herself, because she was that kind of woman, the kind who processes the unsurvivable quietly, in private, over years, the kind whose goodness is so fundamental that even betrayal cannot fully corrupt it. She never spoke about the letters again, not to us, not to Melvy. Some things a person carries alone. The doctor, when he arrived, said it was a heart attack. He said this clinically and correctly. But the nurse, who had been standing in that room, who had watched every second of it, told us quietly, much later, that in all her years she had never seen a heart attack look like something a person was fighting to earn. The exorcist succeeded. Melvy came back to herself slowly, the way you come back from a fever, piece by piece, the world reassembling itself around you, while you try to remember where you are in it. Her father died the same night. We saw his face before they covered him. His eyes were open. His hands were clenched, not loosely, not the way hands go in sleep, but tight, with the white-knuckled certainty of someone who spent their last moment bracing against something. Whatever he had seen was still there in his face. Nobody tried to explain it. Nobody said anything at all. We stood in that room and were very quiet, and after a while, one by one, we left. Some things you don't discuss, not because they're unspeakable, because the words aren't built for them. Chapter 2. What the journal carried. We visited Melvy in the days after her father's burial. It was then she told us about the package. Months before the possession, before any of it, a parcel had arrived at their home addressed to her father. It had been mailed from out of state. The return address was a name none of them recognized, a family name that meant nothing to any of them. Inside the parcel was a journal, and something else. Something wrapped carefully in cloth, a biological thing that should not have survived the mailing and yet had. Amor's family, in their grief and confusion, had preserved and sent what little remained of Salome, the only physical proof that she had ever existed. Her father had received it, had held the parcel in his hands, had understood enough from the name on the return label to know who it had come from, and had chosen not to open it. Not because he didn't care, because he was afraid. He had convinced himself that Amor was alive, that she had moved on, and that whatever was in that parcel was designed to destroy the life he had built. He sealed it. He put it in a box in the attic. He said nothing to anyone. He never knew that Amor was gone. He never knew because nobody knew. She had been 17 years old. That's the first thing Melvie told us. Not because it was the most important thing, but because it was the fact that made all the other facts make sense. The shape of the loneliness, the particular cruelty of the hope. 17 years old and in love with someone who had made her a promise before he left. He was being reassigned to the Philippines for work. It wasn't goodbye, he had told her. It was a delay. He would send for her. They would have a home, a real home, not the small apartment she shared with her family. He used the word family the way people use words when they mean them completely, or when they need you to believe they mean them completely. There is no way to know afterward which one it was. She wrote about his promises in the journal the way someone writes about things they have decided to believe absolutely. Not naively. She was not naive, the journal made that clear. But with the deliberate commitment of someone who understood that hope was a choice she was making and had decided to make it anyway. She was carrying his child when he left. He didn't know, or perhaps he did and said nothing. The journal doesn't resolve this. Amor herself didn't know by the end, and the not knowing had become one of the many wounds that wouldn't close. At first, his letters came regularly. He was adjusting, he was working, he was saving. He mentioned the home often enough that she held on to the word like something physical. Home. She had underlined it in one of his letters, Melvie said. Just that word. Underlined with a steadiness that suggested she had pressed down harder than she intended. Then the letters changed. They grew shorter. The gaps between them stretched. The word home disappeared without announcement, the way a light goes out in a window, and you don't notice until you realize you've been looking at darkness for some time. And then there was the letter. One letter. He had met someone. He was sorry. He wanted her to understand that what they had was real, that he had meant everything, and here Amor had pressed so hard with her pen that the paper nearly tore, that he hoped she would find happiness. He never mentioned the baby. He may not have known, but he never asked either. What Melvie found in the pages that followed was the most difficult part to read, not because Amor raged, though she did, and the rage was searingly articulate, every word placed with the precision of someone using language as the only weapon left available to them. But because alongside the rage was something that made the rage almost beside the point. She had kept waiting. Even after the letter, even after she understood, some part of her had continued for weeks to listen for a knock at the door, to calculate how long a flight would take, to imagine what she would say when he came to explain, because surely there was an explanation, surely one letter was not the whole story. The journal documented this in real time, the war between what she knew and what she couldn't stop hoping. Reading it, Melvie said, was like watching someone drown slowly in a glass of water. And then there was the other woman. Amor had learned her name eventually, through the careful, methodical work of someone with nothing left to do but find things out. She had written about her with a controlled hatred that was somehow more disturbing than hysteria. She wondered, at length, across multiple entries, whether this woman knew, whether she had been told about Amor, whether she was an accomplice or simply someone who had met a man and fallen in love and had no idea what she was stepping into. She had thought about hurting her. She wrote it plainly. She did not dress it up. She was 17 years old, alone, carrying a child who had no father, and she had imagined very specifically what she would do to the woman who had inherited the life she had been promised. The entries were cold in a way that was harder to read than anger, methodical, detailed, the thoughts of a girl who had been pushed far enough past the edge of herself that cruelty had become thinkable. But even in those entries, she knew. The woman was not the architect of this. She had not made a promise in a small apartment before boarding a plane. She had not written the letter. She had not used the word home and then simply stopped meaning it. The rage had a name. It was not the other woman's name. And yet the hatred for her sat in the journal like a splinter, because she was living the life Amor was supposed to have, because she was sleeping beside the man who had promised Amor a family, because she probably didn't know, and her not knowing was its own particular cruelty. She got to be innocent while Amor got to be destroyed. The other woman, we understood then, was Melvy's mother. The quiet, steady woman we had watched stumble through her own gate in terror on the night of the possession. The woman who had asked about letters from a stranger and believed every lie she was given. She had not stolen anything. She had simply fallen in love with a man who was carrying a secret she had no way of seeing. Amor knew this, somewhere under the fury, but knowing and feeling are not the same country. She made a choice. The journal made this clear, and Melvy said it quietly, without drama, because there was no way to say it that would make it easier to hear. Amor had not been overcome by a moment. She had thought about it the way she thought about everything, carefully, methodically, with the clear-eyed precision that ran through every page of that journal. She had written through the decision across several entries, examining it from every angle, arguing with herself, and then arriving, with terrible calm, at a conclusion. She chose a night when her family was sleeping. She wrote her final entry first. She addressed it to Salome, who was still with her, still living in the only way Salome ever would, and she said everything a mother would want a child to know if the child would never be old enough to hear it. That she was loved, that she had always been loved, that none of this, none of it, had anything to do with her. She ended the entry mid-sentence because her hands had begun to shake and the words had become difficult to form, and at a certain point she understood that she had said enough. She was 17 years old when she decided that the world had become a place she could no longer remain in. She met that decision with the same quiet resolve she had brought to every other choice she had ever made, and she did not look away. That is not tragedy wearing the costume of strength. That is just the truth of who she was, taken all the way to its end. What she felt in those final hours, the grief, the betrayal, the absolute certainty that she was leaving the world, having never been given the chance to be understood, did not go quietly. It curdled. It transformed. It became something that had no interest in peace and no use for forgiveness, something that had been forged in the precise temperature of a love that was never answered and a life that was never allowed to begin. That was what was in the journal, not just words. Her. The real her, the one she had become in the end. Furious and forsaken, and absolutely unwilling to disappear without being known. Her grief had stopped being grief somewhere in those final pages. It had become something older and darker and patient in the way that only truly wronged things are patient. Something that understood it had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. Her family had found her. They had grieved. They had not read the journal. They understood it was private, that it was hers, that it belonged to the man she had loved. They preserved what they could of Salome. They addressed the parcel to the man who had never come back, and they mailed it, and they believed that was the end of their obligation to the living. They didn't know what they were mailing. When Melby's father sealed that box and put it in the attic, he sealed her inside it too. And when Melvy, curious, innocent, 12-year-old Melvy, climbed up into that attic and opened the box and unfolded the journal and began to read the words of a woman she had never known, she didn't know what she was holding. She thought she was only reading. The acacia grove had a history that predated every living person in our town. Before the trees, there had been a house, a large house, built during the Spanish colonial period, owned by a family whose name we only knew in fragments, spoken rarely and always in lowered voices, the way names are spoken when the person carrying them has left behind more darkness than memory. The house had a basement. What happened in that basement no one in our town described completely. They described it in pieces, in the way you describe something that has no clean ending and probably never will. During the war, a number of wounded Spanish soldiers had taken shelter inside its walls. They had believed they were hiding. They were wrong. The house was set on fire, and none of them made it out, and the screaming, according to the oldest people in our town, the ones who had inherited the story rather than witnessed it, had lasted long enough to be heard from the road. Nature moved in afterward the way it does when humans abandon a place entirely, slowly, completely, without asking permission. Vines first, then roots, then the spreading canopy of acacia trees that grew faster in that soil than anywhere else in our town, as though the ground itself was generous with what had been fed into it. Within decades the house was gone, or rather it had not gone anywhere but had simply been swallowed. The walls and the roof and the basement and everything inside the basement absorbed into something that looked, from the road, like nothing more than a dense thicket of old trees. The largest acacia, the one at the center, the one whose roots had split the front steps of a house no one could see anymore, was old enough to have been standing when the soldiers burned. It had witnessed all of it, and it was still there, larger every year, spreading its canopy a little further each season, as though it intended eventually to cover everything. People in our town understood the grove without needing to be taught. You didn't walk through it. You didn't linger near its edges after dark. You didn't explain this rule to children. You simply carried it in your posture, in the way you crossed to the other side of the road, and children absorbed it the way children absorb all the true things, through the body first, long before the mind catches up. It was not haunted in the way that word is commonly used. Haunted implies something incomplete, something waiting for resolution. The grove was not waiting for anything. It had simply become, over the course of many decades of accumulated violence and grief and unresolved screaming, a place where the boundary between the living and everything else had worn thin. Not a wound exactly, more like a place where the fabric of things had been rubbed away by too much weight pressing against it for too long. This is what Melvie had walked past. This is what had recognized her. The journal had opened the door. Amor's grief and fury had needed a vessel, and the vessel was Melvie, and the door was the journal. But the grove was where Amor's spirit had first found its footing in our world, drawn to the only place in our town where the living and the dead could almost touch, where the centuries of trapped souls, soldiers who burned, people who suffered in a basement and never left, offered something to a newly arrived fury that had nowhere else to go. She had not come through the grove. She had gotten stronger there. The acacia tree had seen it all before. It was patient about these things. Author's note: this story is inspired by true events. The world it was born from, the Philippines, the Catholic faith, the small town still living in old ways, the acacia grove, the community that gathered and prayed, that world was real. The details that feel too specific to be invented exist because some things cannot be fully imagined. They can only be remembered and then quietly given different names. Every name in this account, including those of the spirits at its center, has been changed to protect the living and honor the privacy of the dead. To the girl at the center of this story, wherever you are in the world, I hope life has been kind to you.